Hi everyone, it's Kendall here, and what we have today is our final block in the current Brackman Mystery Series, so block number 18 or week number 30 of the continuing series. As you can see on the wall behind me, I have decided on my final layout, and I will get working on our setting video very shortly. Once that setting video has been done, there will be no more videos in this Brackman series, but stay tuned for a future video that will be a big update for what will be happening on my channel. Wednesday videos will be continuing until the end of the Grandma's Kitchen Sew Along. Alrighty, without much further ado, let's spin that wheel. Brackman ID 1627 gives us another block that has 3 separate variations, and in those variations has many different names. So 1627A gives us a block that had 3 separate names depending on where it was published. The first one being the Railway Quilt, which was in the Royal New Yorker in 1934. This was a periodical that was from the Rural Publishing Company of New York, which began in 1841. This was published through the mid-20th century. This was a apparently unique pattern column written by Mrs. R.E. Smith from 1930 through to 1937. She mentioned once that the column was syndicated, but Barbara has not seen it anywhere else. The second name this was known by was the 5440 or Fight, which was a Ruth Finlay design. This appeared in Old Patchwork Quilts and the Women Who Made Them, which was a J.P. Lippincott of Philadelphia publication in 1929. The third name this was known by was Grandma's Star by Clara Stone. This was a periodical called Practical Needlework Quilt Patterns, which was a C.W. Corkins & Co. from Boston, Massachusetts publication in 1906. Moving right along, we have 1627B, which was also known by 3 separate names depending on where it was published. The first being Garden Walk, which appeared in the Kansas City Star in 1940. The second being Garden Patch, which was a Grandma Dexter design, who had a series of booklets published in the early 1930s. And the final one, it was just called the Texas Block, which was a Nancy Page design. And this was a syndicated mail order column which was written by Florence LeGank Harris and appeared in many periodicals in the late 20s and 40s. Finally, we have 1627C, which was just by one name, and it was the Bird of Paradise and appeared in a publication called Quilt World in 1976. This periodical has been published since 1976 by the House of White Birches of Seabrook, New Hampshire. 1627C is by far my favourite one of these 3. However, we are going to reject this block. And I will put a note in the description box below. I have actually covered how to do the triangle in a square 2 at a time using a manual method. There are tools available for the triangle in a square, and the easiest way to make them is with the AccuQuilt system, and I will point out which week's patterns had all of that information in, and a link to the video where I actually do show you those techniques. So, with all of that being said, 3 minutes in, we are rejecting this block, so let's spin that wheel again. Brackman ID 1637 gives us the Four Corners block, which was a Grandma Dexter design. These were a series of booklets that were published in the early 1930s from the Virginia Snow Studios. This was a part of the Dexter Yarn and Thread Company and Collingbourne Mills in Elgin, Illinois. Tailor batting patterns are very similar to Grandma Dexter designs, and the Grandma Dexter booklets included Grandma Dexter's applique and patchwork quilt designs, Grandma Dexter's applique and patchwork designs, and Grandma Dexter's new applique and patchwork designs. Now you will notice that in the corner of this block we would have a set-in seam or a Y seam being pointed out now by my lovely red arrow assistant. However, I am changing that so that we will just have some straight piecing. As you can see from this image, the corners will be much simpler to put together, and I'm sure Grandma Dexter won't mind with me making the change. Alrighty, let's get to it. As always, folks, on the table in front of me is all of the pieces we need to make this week's block, and normally you would see next to the A and D fabrics that little image that indicates to cut them twice on the diagonal. But because I always show you in the videos how to do those quarter square triangle units 2 at a time, I've left that little image off this week, and that is exactly where we are going to start. Now we should have 3 A squares and 3 D squares, all at 5.5 inches. We are going to treat these at first like we're making half square triangles by taking all of our light fabrics and drawing a diagonal line on the wrong side, corner to corner in one direction only. We'll then match these up with right sides together with our print fabric, and we'll take that to the machine and stitch 1/4 inch on each side of the drawn line. We'll then take those to our pressing mat, and I like to give them a quick press first before slicing them in half on our drawn line and then pressing them all to the darker of the 2 fabrics. It's once we have this done that we vary from when we're making half square triangles. We now need to nest these in pairs to move to the next step, and I am using this directional fabric, so you will see me just do a quick check here to make sure that both of my pieces will still have the same direction. I try and point out what I'm doing, but it actually makes no sense to me, and even as I was doing it, I'm like, is that actually even showing anything? So the best thing to do is to just nest your 2 half square triangles together and then make sure that your print is going in the right direction by flipping it up on the half. Now I think I'm showing you that on the top they're going vertically and on the back they're horizontally, but I don't know that that's actually making any difference at all. I try to think ahead when I'm filming of things I need to point out rather than just do them and hope that you catch it, but then when I'm coming to do the voiceovers, it's not actually making much sense to me. So just do that little flip test and you'll be fine. We now need to draw another line on this, and the important thing is that we have this perpendicular to our stitching line or at a 90-degree angle. So take a reference line from your ruler and place that on your stitching line, and then draw your line across the piece, and it doesn't matter if it's not exactly corner to corner. What matters most is that it is perpendicular or at a 90-degree angle to your original stitching line. We now take this to the machine and stitch once again 1/4 inch on each side of that drawn line. We will once again take this to the pressing mat and press them first to settle those stitches into the fabric and ease any distortion caused by sewing on the bias. And then we will cut them in half on that drawn line. And then I believe that I do open up the seams and spin them for when I press. Now, just while I'm pressing these, you will notice that in some instances my directional fabric was going up and down with the dark fabric at the top and the bottom of the piece. And then we need 3 of those because they will go down the center of the block. Then what I needed was to have 2 that are like this, with the vertical lines of my directional fabric being at the left and the right of the block instead. So I futzed around during that fast forwarding and I was able to achieve that. We only need 5 of the 6 that we create, but it was important for me to make sure that I had at least 2 where the vertical lines on my fabric work on the left and the right hand side, and 2 or 3, where like this one, where the vertical lines were going from the top and the bottom. So that was just an added layer of complexity. And if you don't want or need all your directional fabrics to go in the same direction, then just do whatever you like. The lucky thing with this is because we start with a square and we are basically dissecting it into quarters on the diagonal, we should automatically get 3 of each. And that will be demonstrated when we come to the AccuQuilt section later. We are now ready to trim down these quarter square units, and we need to trim them down to 4.5 inches, which is our unfinished size for all units to make our 12-inch finished block. So we find our 2.25 inch mark on our 6.5 inch Creative Grids square ruler, and we place that in the center of where all of our pieces create that cross. We then make sure that we have our diagonal line from the ruler along that seam line. And then you check in the top and bottom corners, so the top left and the bottom right, to make sure that the 4.5 inch mark is dissecting those 2 seams, and you can trim those first 2 sides. With those first 2 sides trimmed, we just rotate the block around, and we can now place our 4.5 inch marks on those freshly trimmed sides. Once again, just making sure that we're still on our diagonal, and trim away the final 2 sides. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Once again, I do apologize for the glare of the light. I am going to be shifting things around in the coming weeks, so future videos should not have that problem. We now just need to make up the 4 remaining corner units that we need for this block, and for that we'll pull in our B, C and E fabrics. We're going to start by just stitching our C and E fabrics together in pairs and then pressing towards the darker of the 2 fabrics. Once again, because I am working with this directional fabric, I'm going to make sure that all of my lines there in the background are running vertically. To make sure we get the correct orientation for these corner units, we're going to make 2 piles of 2, and we're going to have our E fabric over to the left on one set and over to the right on the other set of two before joining our B rectangles to the top. This will just allow for when we lay it out that the block is a little bit more symmetrical. If you don't get this right, you can still place the pieces in there. It's just the pieces won't be symmetrical around the block, and my little OCD brain wouldn't allow me to do that. So just make the two stacks of two, have one lot on the left, one lot on the right, and attach the B rectangle, and then press all of those towards the B rectangle. We are now ready to lay this block out for its final 9-patch construction. So I've put the little image on the top right hand corner there, and we just need to make sure that with our directional fabrics that the 3 down the center are in fact going vertically top to bottom. I was just swinging that around to see if I'm going to be able to nest those intersections, and I'm not. So I am going to put some little clips in when I come to sew those rows, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now we just make sure that our 2 on the side here do have the darker fabric on the left and the right, and that it's also running vertically. And now I can place my very symmetrical and perfectly pieced corner units, which also have the directional fabric running vertically. And then it dawned on me the other day that I've made sure that all of my directions and directional fabrics are all going the right way. Once I turn the block on point though, they're no longer going up and down in the block, are they? They're going at a 45-degree angle. But anyway, we're now going to instill our 9-patch construction rules by sewing all of our vertical seams, followed by our horizontal seams. For pressing on these ones, it gets a little bit weird. So just press in whichever direction you think is best and less bulky. You may or may not have seen through that fast-forwarded footage that wherever the seam allowances weren't going to nest, I just clipped in and moved one of them in the opposite direction just so that it sits nice and flat for the final product. And it looks like for the top and the bottom row, I am pressing out towards those corners. It does miss the bulk of our quarter square triangle on both sides. And then in the center row, I'm obviously going to press in towards that quarter square triangle. Steam is your friend here, just to help you warm the fibers of the fabric, and they'll be more malleable to go in the way that you want them. If you have a clapper, that would be the perfect time to sit it on top and let that cool down completely so that it does hold the position that you have forced it into against its will. Should we all be arrested? Nobody call the quilt police. And then we're ready to do our first horizontal row. Now, because these intersections will be bulky, especially where all those quarter square triangles are, we will have up to 8 pieces of fabric coming together in the one intersection. I will, of course, spin those intersections to the best of my ability. As always, when we go to spin these intersections, we do just need to pick out the few little stitches that are outside our horizontal stitching line on both sides of our piece. This will allow us to open up those seam allowances, and then we can move them all in the same direction, be that clockwise or counterclockwise. So I'm just going to let you watch through this, and then I'll fast forward when I do the other one. So as if by magic, our block that we chose to do for this week is now done. And any of that fast forwarding, you can change the settings within YouTube to slow that footage down if you need to. Let's now take a look at how we would make this week's block using our AccuQuilt cutting system and our 8-inch mix and match cube. We would need shapes 2, 4 and 8. Remembering I am using the 6-inch mix and match cube as I do not own the 8-inch mix and match cube, and that just means that I'll have a 9-inch block instead of the 12-inch block. Important things to remember when you are using your AccuQuilt die boards is that you can use it in whichever way you like. But the way that I prefer to remember things is I always keep the sticker from the die board towards my tummy. And then I place the fabric on the die board with the lengths of grain going perpendicular to the rollers. What this allows for is the lengths of grain has less give or stretch than the crosswise grain, and you are guaranteed to have a lot more accurate cutting. Once we have all of this cut out, I will just fast forward through the construction as it is basically identical to how we constructed the first block. I will just note that when using AccuQuilt, I do press all of my seam allowances open because I find that the shapes on the die boards have a very scant 1/4 inch. And with that, my 9-inch version or AccuQuilt version of this block is complete. And I'm actually really quite fond of this block. So as always, I thought, what does this look like on repeat? And coming together, you get little diamonds that are created by a secondary pattern, but you could separate it with just some sashing and cornerstones, as I've shown you with many of our other quilts in the past. Then I thought, what if we reversed the color placement on the block? So we would end up with something like this, and then we would have a version of this quilt where every other block is the reverse color. And I think that that is really quite striking. And last but not least, here is what this quilt would look like on point, just with the blocks side by side, and finally with sashing and cornerstones. Okay, folks, that's it. Block number 30 in the bag. So if you've liked what you've seen today, I would love if you would like the video, share it with a friend that you think may be interested, subscribe if you haven't already done so, tickle that little bell icon to be notified of all my future releases, and you won't miss a thing. I've been Kendall. You've been fabulous. I'll see you all again real soon. Bye for now.